There is a haunting kind of darkness that seldom visits the land, a hush that presses so close upon the living that even the animals feel its approach. On the evening of July 17th, 1878, Bellamy Farm in Montgomery County, Tennessee, was blanketed by such a darkness. The sunset was nothing but a smear of dull vermilion trapped behind the canopy of ancient pines that had stood longer than memory. Yet the world beneath those trees, within the borders of the Bellamy fields, seemed to be holding its breath. The farm itself was the work of generations, weathered hands and stubborn hearts shaping 50 acres of hard bargained land into something productive. Cornfields rose in rows so tidy they could be counted by the stars. Slender tobacco leaves unfurled each morning, glistening beneath a film of dew. The farmhouse, meanwhile, creaked and settled upon its stone foundation like an old warhorse yearning for retirement. White paint peeled in curling strips. Whole sections of the porch sagged under decades of footfall. But for the Bellamys, this was home. Proof that endurance itself could claim a patch of soil in a world determined to take and take. Inside, the evening meal was over. Plates scraped clean, cooled buckwheat cakes forgotten on the counter, coffee turning bitter as it cooled in its pot. There was a pattern to these nights, a routine that promised comfort, but tonight, nervous glances flickered between candle and window. Even the family's youngest, Ruth, only 8, with the sleepy eyes of innocence yet untouched, was restless, reluctant to climb the stairs to bed. Amelia Bellamy, the matriarch, watched in silence. Her gaze swept beyond the cracked glass to the outskirts of the cornfield, where the stalks swayed with a rhythm at odds with the still air. She pressed a palm against the window pane, steadying herself with a slow breath. For weeks the farm had felt different. Some deep, unspoken alarm tugged at her during the quietest hours. There had been bountiful harvests before, yes, but never such unnatural abundance. This season the earth gave too much. More grain, thicker stalks, larger leaves. The bounty delighted Eli, her husband, but left her unsettled. There were tales told among the neighboring farms of accidents, illnesses, birth defects among the livestock. Blame shifted like wind, but some pointed to Bellamy land, and Amelia felt the burn of those rumors in town, whispered at the grocer's stall and in the pews on Sundays. Even the family's cats, fierce and well-fed mouses with soot-black fur and white-tipped tails, moved differently now. They avoided the fields after dusk, huddled in the barn as though sheltering from a coming storm. More than once Thomas, tall, broad-shouldered, barely 22 but already weathered by labor, had chased the animals from the pantry, where they clawed at hidden corners, hissing with their backs arched. And then there were the tracks, strange impressions found in the tilled dirt. Sometimes a single set, sometimes several, always deeper and wider than any man's boot. No rain had fallen for days, and yet the furrows appeared wet, dark and reluctant to dry, as if something cold and persistent had passed through in the night. It was Ruth who saw the first shadow. As twilight retreated, and the family gathered around the parlor's oil lamp, she shrank into her mother's lap, face pale and voice flat. "There's someone in the corn." All eyes whipped to the window, but by then nothing moved, only the wavering stalks, whispering secrets to the wind. Hours passed. The children were finally sent to bed, climbing the steps in a nervous procession. Thomas volunteered for nightly rounds, claiming he needed the air, but everyone knew his unease was restless, unable to settle indoors. Stepping out onto the porch, lantern in hand, he moved from one end of the rail to the other, his boots scuffing worn grooves into the planks. Out in the fields, all that could be heard was the faint crackling of plant husks and the distant, restless low of cattle shifting in the dark. Eli joined his son. Coat shrugged across his shoulders, a shotgun resting loosely in his grip. "You hear that quiet, boy?" he muttered, voice barely audible above the stillness. "That ain't a good quiet. Something out there's waiting. I can feel it." Thomas only nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Time lost shape in the dark. Minutes became hours as the two men traced slow circles around the barn, pausing to squint at rustling shadows. When it seemed as though the hollow silence might last until dawn, it was torn apart by a sound neither would ever forget. A scream, sharp and high, slicing from the northernmost field with the clarity and violence of breaking glass. It was not the cry of coyote or wildcat, nor the drunken shout of a neighbor on a late-night wander. This was a voice unmistakably human and ripped open by terror, A man's throat could not produce such agony. Neither Thomas nor Eli could place its pitch. It was something birthed in pain that did not belong to this earth, and the sound dug hooks into their chests, commanding them to move. The two men plunged into the corn, lantern beams lurching across the twisted, shifting walls of green. Leaves slapped at their faces. Roots tangled their feet. The scream had stopped as abruptly as it had begun, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed against their temples. They ran on instinct, following a sense of dread that thickened with each footstep. In a clearing trampled flat by some unseen force, they found it, fabric torn from a dress smeared with a dark maroon stain that glistened in lantern light. The ground was churned, footprints pointing in every direction, all facing outwards as if desperate to escape whatever stood in the center. There was no body, no sign of movement, only a hollow, puckered silence that gnawed at their certainty. The air was heavy with a coppery tang that choked Eli and sent Thomas stumbling backwards, bile rising in his throat. When they returned to the house, they found Amelia waiting at the door, arms clutched across her chest, face ashen. She saw the evidence in their hands, the torn cloth, the blood. There was no need for words. That night, the family slept fully clothed, windows locked, firearms propped within reach. Ruth whimpered in her sleep, while Amelia lay awake listening to the steady tick of the clock and the uncertain hush in the rafters. But it was not only the Bellamys who heard the scream that night. By morning, rumors snaked their way through the fields, swirling among the farmhands and wives at the well. A child was missing from the neighboring plantation, last seen near the boundary line that met Bellamy land. Horses refused to plow eastward. Chickens would not leave their coops. Some whispered about a curse, the land giving more than it should, demanding retribution in blood. The sun rose sluggishly the next day, its rays dimmed beneath a curtain of oppressive clouds. Flies gathered in thick black knots around the fields, crawling along the windows like harbingers of plague. The harvest, swollen and glossy, motioned in the windless morning, seeming to reach hungrily for the sky. Within the Bellamy household, breakfast was eaten in tense silence. Eli met Thomas's gaze across the table, each knowing they would venture out again. Each step among those rows was a test of nerve, the burden of fear heavy as stones in their boots. Somewhere in the fields, something watched, waiting for night's cover to reclaim its domain. And every moment of peace was now tinged with the certainty that it could not last. For the night had broken open with a scream, and the Bellamys could not turn back from whatever darkness had crept into their harvest. So began the legend, not with violence fully witnessed, nor with the discovery of a corpse, but with a family changed at its roots, a single dreadful sound echoing in the marrow of every dawn and gathering dusk to come. The Bellamy farm was no longer just land carved from wilderness. It had become a threshold, and as the days crept on, the difference between what was alive and what was hunted grew steadily harder to tell. Dawn arrived grudgingly. The grey light crawled across the floorboards, brushing against the walls of the Bellamy house, as though reconsidering whether it truly belonged there. For the first time in years, birds delayed their song. Slight draughts moaned through the gaps in the old windows, and the pungent scent of damp earth pressed into the kitchen before anyone had the courage to speak. Breakfast was a tense ritual. Eli chewed each mouthful in silence, lost in thoughts he dared not share with his family. Amelia's hands trembled as she poured chicory coffee, knuckles white from holding the pot a shade too tight. Ruth pressed, her nose to the edge of the table, spoon scraping grooves into the wood. Thomas simply stared out the window, jaw taut, eyes searching the horizon for any sign of movement within the corn, hoping, perhaps, for something explainable to step out and reveal itself. By mid-morning, the unease had settled across the whole farm. Word of the night's scream had spread quickly. Neighbors arrived in small, wary groups, some on foot, some by wagon, none wanting to be the first to speak the question that weighed in every gaze. Mark Woods, broad-shouldered and quick to anger, was the first to break the hush. "Something's gone wrong on this land," he declared. "We all heard it." Lila, his wife, clutched their toddler close, eyes darting to the dense green rows that walled off the field's edge. Nobody from the Bellamy family answered immediately. Grief and uncertainty stiffened their backs. Sheriff Ezra McCallum arrived just before lunch, his boots tracked with dust, his grey moustache bristling with suspicion. He questioned Eli and Thomas in turn, asking for details about the footprints, the torn cloth, the direction of the scream. As each answer left their lips, McCallum's features grew grimmer. The missing child, Jacob from the Turner family across the northern boundary, had vanished without a trace. His mother's wail had joined the dawn's wind, and her silence now was brittle and absolute. Under the sheriff's orders, men from neighboring farms swept the fields, forming lines and combing between the corn rows. Their boots snapped stalks, dogs sniffed the ground, but found only crumbling dirt and the stale memory of fear. Within an hour they returned, faces ashen, having found nothing but the blood-stained cloth. No new clue, no evidence, as if the earth itself had swallowed the truth. Inside, Amelia gathered her daughters around the parlor, trying to shield Ruth and Mary from the fear that had settled like mildew. She read aloud from a book of Psalms, with trembling lips, but her words failed to fill the silence. Even prayers felt insufficient within these walls, prayers carried out more out of habit than hope, their faith shaken by the scream and the secrecy of the dawn. As afternoon waned, Ruth wandered into the kitchen, pulling at the hem of Amelia's apron. "Why is everybody scared, Mama? Why doesn't the sheriff find Jake?" Amelia tried to smooth her daughter's hair, voice gentle. "Sometimes things happen that grown-ups can't explain," she said, the lie heavy in her chest. "We trust the Lord in each other, and we wait." But Ruth, sensitive and curious, pressed further. "Will it come back tonight?" Her question sat unanswered as the clock ticked and shadows lengthened. That evening, the routine of chores grew mechanical, a desperate attempt at normalcy. Thomas mucked stalls that did not need mucking, hands shaking. Eli fixed the fence along the Turner boundary, glancing back at every snap of a twig. Chickens were coaxed into their coop long before dusk, horses locked in as if a storm approached. No one mentioned the missing child, but a single scrap of blue ribbon found on the boundary line was tied to the barn door. A silent warning. As the sun vanished behind ragged clouds, heavy air settled over the fields. The harvest was thick and lush, and yet no one in the Bellamy family could admire it now. Instead, they met in the parlor, lanterns burning, doors bolted, and rifles on knees. They waited. For what? No one could say. Night fell, with silence trailing in its wake. Tension hung in the air, palpable as smoke. Thomas volunteered for the first watch, his mind replaying the events of the previous night in feverish detail. He paced the length of the porch with a loaded lantern and a heart thumping against his ribs. Each footstep an attempt to slow time, to control the uncontrollable. Minutes stretched, strung out thin and brittle. Cicadas sang. Then the fields grew quiet. So quiet Thomas thought he was losing his mind. Every breeze rattled his nerves. Every shadow seemed to twist, reaching for the threshold between normal and nightmare. Only the muffled whimper of Ruth, clutching her bed above, reminded him this was all painfully real. Then, as midnight neared, the quiet ruptured. Not with a scream this time, but with a low, drawn-out moan as if the land itself were protesting. It started deep, almost imperceptible, a vibration more felt than heard. The corn nearest the boundary line seemed to flex, roots groaning under the strain. Thomas called for his father as dread blossomed in his chest. Eli burst from the parlor with a lantern and shotgun, old instincts overtaking sense as he joined his son at the porch. From the darkness at the field's edge, they saw something move. A ripple, a disturbance as if something heavy slid through the thickest rows. The shape itself remained hidden, but the corn parted with unnatural precision, stalks bowing in surrender. The ground beneath the disturbance appeared to dip, sinking subtly, leaving a trail of exposed black earth that glimmered wetly in the faint light. No one spoke, no one breathed. Only the sound of roots being pulled from the earth and the faintest whimper from within the house cut the silence. Eli fired a warning shot toward the motion, the crack echoing into the hills. But the disturbance simply stopped. For a moment, everything stilled, as if the world paused, listening. And then, from deep within the corn, a whispering chorus, voices layered upon one another, distant and wrong. They murmured phrases in no tongue known to any man, the cadence jagged, urgent, impossible. Thomas staggered back, hand to his mouth, bile and fear nearly swallowing him whole. Eli muttered a prayer, half believed, his faith buckling under the weight of that sound. There was no more sleep that night. The Bellamy family, and the neighbors, who'd come to watch, to help, or out of grim curiosity, sat in tight knots until dawn, waiting for a sorrow neither courage nor preparation could repel. When morning finally cut through the gloom, it brought only more questions, more fear, and an understanding that whatever stalked their fields was not finished. The Bellamys and their land were bound now to a cycle of harvest and dread. The fields, once a promise of prosperity, had become a living thing, hungry, secretive, unwilling to surrender what it had claimed. And as day broke, the corn cast long shadows across trampled clothes and haunted soil, shrouding the farm in half-light and suspicion. The legend was no longer a whisper. It had rooted itself in every tongue, every glance, every creak in the floorboards when night approached. Yet beneath the fear, a resolve began to bud, for the Bellamys understood that the nights to come would demand not only vigilance, but sacrifice, and as the harvest loomed, the family steeled themselves for the price in blood the land might yet demand again and again. By the third day, fear had sunk its roots deep into the Bellamy household, coiling around every spoken word, every glance exchanged in weary silence. Even the hired hands, hardened men who'd faced blight, drought, and pestilence, began asking to be paid early, their excuses thin and unconvincing. They would not step foot beyond the barn after dusk. The air itself had changed. A sour heaviness lingered in the breeze that swept down from the Cumberland hills, mixing the scent of overripe crops with something acrid, the sharp metallic ghost of rot. Off in the distance, Clarksville's church bells rang faintly, their sound warped against the afternoon humidity. In Montgomery County, farms like Bellamy's had always teetered between prosperity and ruin. Tobacco and corn were lifelines, yet every acre demanded blood, blister, and prayer. Each family tilled their fortunes from soil that refused forgiveness for mistakes. But the Bellamy's field seemed cursed with excess, stalks taller than men, grains swollen past reason. What once promised wealth now looked unnatural, like a harvest that had grown on fear itself. Eli Bellamy rode into town that morning, hat in hand, shoulders stiff with unspoken shame. The men at the general store fell quiet when he entered. None dared question him outright, but whispers trailed in his wake, about the scream, the missing child, the soft, strange glow seen near the farm's northern field long after midnight. He purchased kerosene, extra nails, and salt, far more than a man needed for season work, and rode home under a sky that darkened far too early. At the house, Amelia kept the curtains drawn. She'd begun boiling herbs, sage, rosemary, and pennyroyal, filling the air with their sharp perfume as if to drive away whatever spirit had settled over them. Her hands never stopped moving, mending, folding, dusting, the only rhythm that kept her from falling apart. The younger children stayed close to her skirts, silent now, their laughter long gone. Only Thomas seemed restless, chained by the uselessness of waiting. Each night he patrolled the farm like a soldier without orders. But on this evening, while the sun sank and the barn swallows cut shadows across the crimson sky, something in him snapped. He needed proof, a reason, or at least a lie he could believe. He took the lantern and headed north. The cornfield greeted him like a living wall, impossibly still, its edges glistening as if wet beneath the dimming light. He stepped between the rows, boots sinking into soft, damp soil. The path wound deeper under the weight of silence, until even his own breathing sounded foreign. Then, from somewhere ahead came movement, subtle, deliberate, as if something large shifted against the earth. Thomas lifted his lantern high. For a moment all he saw was stalks bent inward, forming what looked like a circle, a hollow within the corn too symmetrical to be natural. The center of it pulsed faintly with color, a shimmer of pale gold under the faint whisper of breeze. He stepped closer. The soil inside that ring was wrong, darker, looser, and breathing warmth. He crouched and reached a hesitant hand toward the center, and froze. Beneath his fingertips something shifted. A crack split the quiet, and the ground itself split open, releasing a hiss thick with the smell of decay. Thomas stumbled back, lantern flickering wildly, flame dancing across something pale, something like fabric or flesh. He ran. By the time he burst through the back door, Chest heaving, Amelia had already sensed it. The lantern shattered against the floor, spreading flame briefly before Thomas stomped it out. "What did you see?" his father demanded, voice straining between fury and fear. But Thomas could only shake his head. "The corn's wrong," he whispered. It's breathing." No one slept that night. The family gathered at the kitchen table, listening to the wind rise. Rain threatened but never fell. The sky glowed faintly along the horizon, as though the dawn had lost its way. Around midnight, a rhythmic rustling began outside. Not the wind nor any known animal, but something coordinated, sweeping through the field in waves. Eli gripped his shotgun tighter. Amelia closed her eyes, muttering scripture more to calm her children than for faith. Thomas stared out the window and swore he saw shapes darting between the rows. Low, stooped things that moved with the cunning of men. Then, out by the edge of the barn, a low moan echoed. Not pain, but labor, as if the land strained to birth something unspeakable. The sound rolled across the property, vibrating through the wooden walls until dishes shook against the table. In the morning, what they found was worse than the night's terror. The fence posts by the Turner boundary had been uprooted, cleanly as though pried by great hands. In their place lay heaps of ruined cornstalks, twisted together into crude human shapes, faces pressed into the dirt. The sheriff returned with a posse 2 days later, pretending calm while his eyes betrayed unease. He ordered the field burned. The Bellamys, exhausted, did not protest. They watched as fire devoured the cursed crop, the sky choked by its smoke. Yet even after the last flame died, the smell of rot lingered, thicker and heavier than before. That evening, Amelia stood alone at the kitchen window, staring at the empty field. The soil shimmered faintly beneath the moonlight, restless, alive. The wind carried faint whispers that might have been nothing more than tricks of sound, or might have been words. The harvest, it seemed, had decided not to die so quietly after all, and as the next night approached, the lands of Montgomery County would learn that some farmland remembers, and some yields more than a man dares to reap. The fire that consumed the Bellamy fields lasted until sunrise. Smoke billowed upward in thick black ribbons, drifting over Montgomery County and settling in distant valleys with silent accusation. Many neighbors gathered at the outskirts, watching the inferno as if waiting for some sign that the curse, rumor, or evil would be lifted with the flames. Yet, as day broke, the ashes were the only prayer answered. The ground lay charred and littered, the scent of scorched corn and tobacco clinging so tightly to the wood of the farmhouse and barn that for days afterward, every breath carried a bitter reminder of what had been lost and of what still lingered. In the hours after the flames died, Eli walked the perimeter of his property, boots treading softly over black, fragile earth. He had aged more in those few days than in all the years of struggle before. His back ached from sleepless nights, mind gnawed by questions he dared not voice. The fields, once his pride, lay ruined, not by drought or blight, but by a terror neither nature nor God seemed willing to explain. Every fence post was now a stark monument in the wasteland, the crude scarecrow shapes burned to featureless lumps. Inside, Amelia faced loss differently. She scrubbed the house anew, washing every trace of ash from the windows, the doors, the porches. Each rag she wrung out felt heavy with the weight of memory, her hands red and raw but never idle. She cooked and mended and whispered to Ruth and Mary not to be afraid. Yet when she caught her own reflection late at night, the pale, drawn face staring back offered no such assurance. For Thomas, the day after the fire was the hardest. He wandered the ruined fields with the battered remains of his lantern, searching for explanation, searching for something to blame beyond luck and legend. The circle he had found still pulsed, its outline visible in the charred earth, a pocket of pale soil surrounded by scorched black. No plants grew there now, nor would they. The soil seemed disturbed, restless, refusing to settle. Each time Thomas stepped near, a wind shivered over the ground, carrying faint whispers, not unlike those he heard on that cursed night. Neighbors offered condolences but kept their distance. Some delivered food and tools, others left buckets of water and jars of preserves at the edge of the property without knocking. The sheriff stopped by twice more, his face tight with guilt and suspicion, but left quickly after confirming nothing new had happened, his boots streaking soot on the Bellamy's porch. By the fourth night, the house became a fortress. Doors bolted, shutters nailed, lamp oil topped off. Eli and Thomas took turns with the shotgun. though with each passing hour the weapon felt more symbolic than useful, a crutch for men struggling to believe in their own control. Ruth barely spoke, Mary slept fitfully, and Amelia prayed constantly, lips moving in silent rhythm even when her hands were busy. Night came in sudden violence. Rain pounding the roof and filling the gutters with muddy runoff. The fields glistened with fresh water, but smoke stubbornly clung to the air. Thunder crackled in the hills and the sky seemed to roil with frustration. The Bellamys huddled in the kitchen, the lantern's glow carving pale arcs into the gloom. Then, in the feverish hush between thunderclaps, a new sound arrived, the unmistakable ring of metal on wood, rhythmic and slow. It came from the fence near the burned fields, a dull clanging as if someone or something hammered at the posts. Eli rose, eyes wide, and Thomas grabbed his shotgun more for comfort than courage. Peering out through the window, Thomas saw only shadows at first, thick and squirming behind the smoke. But then the rain slackened, and he glimpsed movement. A figure hunched and thin, working along the fence line with impossible patience. Each time thunder rolled, the shape froze, blending with the scorched earth and blackened posts. Eli swung the door open, rain lashing his face, and bellowed for the trespasser to leave. The figure straightened. In the dim light, even the eyes seemed wrong, glinting too brightly before turning and vanishing into the darkness. The Bellamys hurried outside, lamp held high, feet sliding in mud and ash. They found nothing but a fresh line of footprints, bare, small, pressed impossibly deep into the sodden ground, each print pointing toward the barren circle in the field. Back inside, Eli pressed a trembling hand to his brow. The family said nothing. They returned to their posts, faces grim and silent as the storm abated. Morning peeled away sleep with cruel indifference. Ruth awoke crying, unable to explain her dream, though her words, spoken through choked sobs, described a ring of figures standing over her bed, their eyes blank, their hands clutching bundles of dead stalks. Amelia shushed her, holding her close, but the image stuck to the walls as surely as smoke. Thomas, unable to keep still, returned to the field with cautious steps, hoping daybreak had swept away the night's horror. Yet the footprints persisted, their edges crisp and fresh, unblurred by rain. Around the barren circle, more stalks had been laid, their roots facing outward as if shielding the burnt patch from the world. Thomas knelt, fingers tracing the cold earth, heart thudding with unease. The air shimmered, and for a moment the wind carried again those low sliding whispers. Eli gathered the family after midday. "We cannot let fear drive us from our land," he said, voice brittle but firm. "This is our home. Whatever's finding us, whatever curses us, it will not win if we stand together." He handed Thomas the shotgun, pressed Amelia's hands in his, and placed Mary and Ruth between them. The words were meant as comfort, but the resolve came at a cost. Every member of the Bellamys braced for what the night would demand. The day passed in nervous motion. Neighbors kept their distance, and even the livestock seemed subdued. Chickens wandered the yard without purpose, and the barn cats remained hidden. Dinner was eaten in silence, interrupted only by the scrape of fork on plate and the distant hum of insects returning with dusk. As evening fell, a new kind of quiet settled over the farm. It was not peace, nor the expectant hush before a storm, but something heavier, saturated with the knowledge that each hour alive was borrowed from the land's growing hunger. The boundaries between inside and out felt more fragile than ever. The wall separating home from field no longer enough. Midnight approached. The lanterns flickered and a gentle wind, fresh, almost sweet, stirred the ashes beyond the kitchen window. Amelia gripped Ruth's hand, eyes locked on the horizon. Then, without warning, the wind rose into a shriek, whistling through every cracked board, every loose shingle, every place the fire had softened the frame of the house. The shriek grew louder, joined by a chorus of moans. Not human, not animal, not weather, but a symphony of suffering that pressed against the windows like a living thing. Shadows moved outside, multiplying as they reached toward the farmhouse, arms outstretched, bodies twisted from smoke and earth. Footsteps rang against the porch, fast, erratic, a dozen. Maybe more. Eli and Thomas fired a warning shot, but the silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, as if the land itself had drawn a breath. The storm broke again, rain pounding in sheets. The wind yanked the shutters, rattling the lantern glass. Through it all, Amelia whispered, her prayer lost beneath the roar. her voice fading as her grip on Ruth's hand tightened. By dawn, the Bellamys were still alive but changed, marked not just by loss, but by something new, a resignation, a bond crafted from terror and survival. The fields outside remained empty, but the footprints returned, more numerous and more deeply pressed into muddy ground. Around the barren circle, something had sprouted overnight, a ring of pale, ghostly shoots curling upward through the ash, defying the rules of nature and reason. Eli knew what must come next. The Bellamys could no longer wait for the land to forgive, nor could they run. The only path left was forward, to confront the thing beneath the soil wherever it led. The story of Bellamy Farm was no longer just a tale of harvest lost or secrets whispered in the corn. It had become a reckoning, a test of will, of family, and of the boundaries between fear and hope. And as the sun struggled to burn away the lingering smoke, it painted the farmhouse in harsh relief, exposing the scars left behind and illuminating the road that stretched out past the edge of the fields toward whatever waited in the heart of Tennessee's darkest night. Dawn brought little comfort. By midday, the skies over Bellamy Farm remained bruised and swollen, as if light itself knew to keep its distance from the land that refused to rest. The fields lay scarred, bare save for that impossible ring of new shoots, pale as bone, rising from the burned-black ash. Each stalk bent at a cruel angle, reaching for the farmhouse instead of the sun. No bird perched among them, no barn cat dared draw near. Inside, the family operated on nerves and sheer habit. Thomas cleaved firewood, not for need, the autumn, warmth held, but for the desperate purpose of keeping his hands busy and his mind away from the memory of churning earth and whispered voices in the fields. Amelia baked and scrubbed, the motions bringing no comfort. Ruth and Mary played beneath the kitchen table with rag dolls, but even their soft chatter faltered whenever a shadow drifted by the window. Eli watched all of it, from his usual seat at the end of the table, clutching the family Bible so tightly, the cover cut crescents into his skin. It was Eli who broke the silence first, voice thin but determined. "We cannot let this evil fester any longer. If there's an answer waiting for us, we'll find it, and together." He met each set of eyes in turn. There was no argument. Each member of the Bellamy family understood that unity was their only defense. The plan came together by afternoon. Each would take a portion of the fields, searching for any clue, a sign, a trail, or something buried beneath the ring of ghastly sprouts. Thomas sharpened the spade. Eli loaded the shotgun. Amelia armed, herself with salt and a pouch of dried herbs passed down from her mother, a woman whose Appalachian roots remembered more about dark land than any Bible ever printed. Ruth and Mary protested being left behind, but Amelia stood firm, urging them to stay safe within locked doors. The search began at the circle's edge, where the soil hummed with a strange, low energy. Eli and Thomas walked shoulder to shoulder, lanterns raised even in daylight, scanning for disturbances among the black powdery dirt. Amelia trailed behind, salt trailing from her shaking hands in a protective line. Her prayers, once whispers, became sharp, urgent pleas. As their boots pressed deeper into the circle, Eli stumbled over something half-buried. He knelt, brushing aside ash and dead grass, revealing a rusty length of chain, links blackened and fused together by the fire. At one end, nails had been bent around the links, driven deep into the soil. Thomas unearthed a second chain nearby, still warm, pulsing with residual heat. Each was set in a rough ring, bordering the pale shoots, as if attempting, and failing, to keep something in or out. A shudder ran through Eli. "This was no accident," he said. "Something or someone meant for it to stay here." The realization worked through the group, binding them in their dread. As the sun slipped lower, clouds gathering thick and angry above the woods, Amelia's resolve hardened. She stepped into the circle, sprinkling salt across each metal link, her voice rising with purpose. She repeated her mother's old words, "That which you sow, you must also reap. Blood pays for blood, pain for pain. May the earth be satisfied, may the living endure." Suddenly the ground beneath her feet buckled. A faint tremor passed through the ash, a pulse like a heartbeat too close to the skin. The sprouting stalks twitched, their roots writhing as if in protest. Thomas pulled Amelia back just as a sharp metallic scent rose from the earth, overwhelming, acrid, unmistakable. From below a sound issued, not a scream or a moan, but a rumbling chant, wordless yet filled with intent. Inside the house, Ruth and Mary pressed their faces to the window, watching the adults retreat from the violent trembling. It was over, in seconds, but the circle had deepened, as if the ground swallowed an inch of itself in defiance. Eli steadied Amelia as the family regrouped, wind gusting in from the wood to scatter loose ash about their feet. "Are we making it angrier?" Thomas asked, but Amelia shook her head. "It's always been angry. We're just forcing it to reveal itself." They returned to the house in a grim procession. Night fell with haste. The lanterns burned late, shadows stretching long across the walls, and every ear strained for sounds neither storm nor beast could explain. Around midnight, just as Ruth began to drift into uneasy sleep, the chanting rose anew, now joined by the steady knocking of something hard against the porch floor. Eli brandished his weapon, his voice breaking as he demanded the unseen tormentors show themselves. In response, the wind whipped viciously, slamming shutters, sending dust swirling through cracks in the walls. For hours, the Bellamys huddled in the kitchen, listening as the world outside bent under the pressure of unseen forces. The chanting peaked, faded, and was replaced by a silence so deep it seemed to swallow all other sound. When the grey light of dawn crept back, the family discovered a new horror. The field's circle no longer empty, but filled with new gifts. Rows of freshly snapped bones laid with unnatural care in perfect spiral, all leading to a shallow depression at the center. At its bottom, the soil glistened, dark and wet, as if freshly watered by unseen hands. The realization struck Eli first. There's something buried here, something old, the farm's bounty, everything. All of it was nourished by what's underneath. Thomas dropped to his knees, scraping at the soil with both hands, determined to reach an answer or confront his own fear. Bone by bone he unearthed a small, stained locket, inside which was a lock of hair and an inscription nearly worn away. "To Will, all my love, Ellen." 1862. The family stood in silent recognition. It was not their secret alone. Their home, their land, their very survival had been bought with the suffering of those long forgotten. Every harvest reaped from Bellamy soil came at a price exacted, in silence, until pain, raw and ancient, finally demanded to be heard. As the sun rose fully, burning off the morning mist, Eli gathered the artifacts and chains and placed them in a burlap sack. Holding each other close, the Bellamys crossed the field to the Turner property line, where the earth remained untouched by fire or fear. They dug a simple grave, lined it with salt and prayers, and reburied the tokens with all the dignity they could muster. Returning home, something in the air had eased, not forgiveness, but the loosening of a terrible grip. Ruth and Mary pressed, close to their mother, asking if the harvest would ever be safe again. Amelia, exhausted but resolute, answered, "It will in time, if we honor what we've learned and remember the price." The family stepped inside, closing the door and leaving the fields to their uneasy peace. Outside, as dusk approached, a wind danced through the pale circle. It whistled among the new stalks, softer now, almost mournful, and carried the last traces of suffering away across the hills, through the woods, toward distant farms that listened and remembered and hoped to be spared. They slept that night as if walking on the brittle crust above a chasm, bodies braced for tremors that might split the earth underfoot. All through the silent hours, the Bellamy house stood opaque with exhaustion, corners alive with shifting shadows, floorboards aching under the patterns of dreams each family member carried in secret. When dawn reluctantly peeled away the dark, revealing thin bars of sunlight across soot-stained floor and rag rug, there was, for the first time in days, no new trace of trespass outside. Yet despite the fleeting relief, every heart in the house knew their work was only partly done. The circle of bones at the heart of the field had been buried. Yes, but memory lingers in the land like a fever in the blood. Uneasy, unresolved, and liable to break through at the slightest disturbance. After a meager breakfast of johnny cakes and preserved peaches, Eli went out with Thomas to walk the property. There was little to say, and nothing left to stake as proof of ownership. The farm felt hollow, as if its substance had been drained while they slept. Even the crows that once scavenged the fields had moved on, their absence as unsettling as their former cries. They began their patrol at the Turner fence, the borderline where the first footprints and bloody cloth had been found. Here, Thomas examined the hard rut carved where the fire had burned hottest. The earth was brittle and crackled under his boots, exposing veins of raw clay beneath. Proof, Eli muttered, that the land would not easily heal. Amelia, meanwhile, kept watch from the porch, trying to shake the feeling of eyes upon her. She noticed that the pale shoots within the old ring now leaned outward, away from the center. They had grown inches overnight, their bases wriggling from the ashen soil as if intent on escape. Ruth and Mary peered at them too, uneasy but unable to resist their morbid curiosity. Amelia called her daughters inside, had them fetch water from the well, and busied their hands with chores, anything to keep young minds from circling back to unspoken terrors. She herself took up a needle, mending the worn places on last winter's blankets. Yet her own thoughts wandered, tripping over memories of that locket and the story it hinted at. A life buried in this place. A sorrow older than any living soul in Montgomery County. By midday, a new sound drew Thomas and Eli's attention. Metallic knocking, steady and deliberate, coming not from the porch this time, but deep in the woods bordering the northern boundary. It echoed just as the earlier clanging had, but farther away, drumming up a tension both men could not ignore. Without a word, they fetched their lantern and shotgun, checking the salt and iron nails left over from Amelia's rituals, then pressed through the brittle corn stubs and into the tangled edge of forest. Among the thorns and oak trunks, the air felt colder, tinged with a sharp coppery scent. Shafts of pale afternoon light trickled down, illuminating the underbrush in greenish haze. Climbing over rotted logs and ducking under hanging moss, Thomas and Eli followed the rhythmic sound, their breathing slowing to match its tempo. It led them steadily toward a clearing they'd avoided for years, once the site of a pre-war tenant house, now collapsed into weed-choked foundation stones. The source of the knocking became clear, a bent shovel, rusted and half-buried beside a stone well choked with brambles. The tool rocked faintly in the wind, its handle sometimes striking a loose rock. But even as they convinced themselves of this natural cause, an unease lingered. The well itself was ringed with fresh, tiny footprints, circling clockwise like the night dancers described in African and Irish folklore. Each print was pressed deeply, too deep for a child, too fresh for yesterday's rain. They peered into the well but saw only their own warped reflections cast across stagnant black water. There was no sign of anything human, alive or dead. Eli gripped the edge, knuckles pale. "We'll cover this. Fill it with stones and forget it," he murmured. Thomas nodded in grudging agreement. Both wanted no more reminders of what the ground could conceal. They returned, limbs stung by nettles and nerves raw, to find the house unchanged. The girls counted marbles on the porch. Amelia shelled peas at the kitchen table, lips pursed in silent calculation. That evening, Thomas and Eli barricaded the well with heavy stones and deadfall from the woods. They hammered the mouth shut, then ringed the mound with salt and iron nails as Amelia had done before. It was a small, defiant act of control in a place that had robbed them of it for too long. But just after sunset, as the last nail was driven, the earth shook, not the brief tremor of wind or passing wagon, but a deep heave, as if something far beneath their feet rose and settled uneasily. Small stones toppled from the barricade. From somewhere in the woods, a chorus of frogs burst into clamorous song, but within the circle of the fields all remained silent. Inside, the family huddled around their table. The tale of the tenant house, the tenant girl, and the ghost stories that stretched back before the war were aired softly. Amelia recounted the family's first years of struggle, of men lost to fever and children buried by the creeks, of harvests ruined and debts forgiven, but never forgotten. She spoke of the need to balance hope with memory, kindness with caution. That night, sleep came easier, but dreams grew heavy. Ruth dreamed of Ellen, the name inside the locket, standing at the edge of the woods, her dress stained with clay, arms outstretched, eyes full of sorrow and yearning. No words passed between them. only a shaking of heads and a slow, sad march back into the trees. When morning returned, it carried no scream, no chant, only the low murmur of wind in the brittle fields. The Bellamys rose, opened their windows, and stepped outside. For the first time since the scream had torn the world apart, the farm felt nearly peaceful. The sprouts in the circle had stopped growing. The circle itself looked less defined. The crows returned, perching on the roof and raiding the ash for seeds. The air, thick with heat and regret, began to feel breathable again. Still, the land would never be what it once was. But neither would the Bellamy family. They had faced the worst of their soil, endured the legacy left beneath its surface, and found in the wreckage the stubborn will to continue rebuilding, morning by morning. Each step they took onto the sunlit yard was its own victory. Each harvest to come would be gathered with care, for the earth, for the dead, for the survivors. The legend of the Bellamy farm, once whispered as a curse, now echoed as a lesson, not just for them, but for every soul in Montgomery County who worked under that unyielding Tennessee sky. By the time the cicadas sang again, life on Bellamy Farm had begun to mimic normalcy. Crops were modest but steady. The smell of ash was gone from the air. Carpets of green rolled across Montgomery County once more, hiding the scars burned into its soil. Yet beneath the quiet rhythm of daily labor, feeding livestock, mending fences, scalding kettles, lay tension, thin and unspoken, like a wound healing wrong. Clarksville bustled that summer. Farmers filled the square, selling tobacco, hogs, and corn, exchanging stories about weather and price. But behind every conversation lurked whispers of what the Bellamys had seen, of voices in the fields, of curses hidden beneath the roots of rich, dark soil. Eli rode into town twice a month, head down, boots muddied from honest work, only to feel the sting of silence each time he entered the general store. Still, he endured it. A man without land in Tennessee was a ghost long before his death. By late August, the family settled into a fragile peace. The girls grew, Ruth now 12, Mary 14, and laughter returned to the farmhouse in small bursts, usually around supper. Amelia managed to coax flowers to bloom again near the porch, yellow and defiant. Yet the fields, even replanted, never looked quite right. Corn grew uneven, tobacco leaves spotted early with a sickness no remedy cured. At night, faint vibrations rippled through the ground, easily mistaken for thunder by those who wanted to believe it. Thomas, restless as ever, took to spending evenings near the northern fence, where the first footprint had been found years before. He'd bring his coffee and sit with his back to the oak stump, smoking in silence, watching the fireflies gather above the fields. He told himself it was only for caution, but deep inside, it was guilt, the kind that stays when something buried still calls your name. One night, while the horizon glowed with late summer heat, he heard a child's laughter drifting from the woods, faint, lilting, familiar. He froze, coffee cooling in his hands. When the breeze shifted, it came again. A girl's laughter, humming the tune Ruth always sang when she shelled peas, though Ruth was asleep in the house. Thomas stood, every instinct warning him back, yet something in that sound tugged him forward. He crossed the fence line barefoot, the soil surprisingly warm, and followed the sound into the tree line. The air changed, thick, damp, laced with the faint sweetness of rot. From beyond a thicket, a dim yellow glow pulsed, small as a lantern flame. When he reached the clearing, he saw her. A figure stood with its back turned, hair pale in the moonlight, wearing a dress he did not recognize but knew from another lifetime. The hem was white, no, gray and heavy with clay. "Ruth?" His voice cracked. The figure turned. It wasn't Ruth. It wasn't even alive. The face was hollowed, eyes pools of dull amber light, mouth trembling as if to speak. But no sound came, only emotion, her hand lifting slowly to point toward the earth where she stood, the same spot where the old tenant well had been covered. "Ellen," he whispered before his mind could stop him. For an instant she looked less ghostly, sad, still almost human. Then the light flickered and she simply wasn't there anymore. Thomas stumbled backward through the brambles, ripped his hand on a thorn and ran until the house loomed above him again. He felt foolish by morning, yet the cut on his palm throbbed as though infected with something colder than fever. At breakfast, he said nothing, but Amelia saw the tremor in his grip and the grey ash under his nails. She did not ask. There were questions better left unspoken, truths the land kept to itself. In town that same day, news travelled faster than memory. Another farm, the Pruitt's place, 2 miles south of Bellamy, had gone barren overnight. Tobacco plants blackened where they stood. Every ear of corn lay hollow, kernels sucked out as though eaten from within. Old Mr. Pruitt swore he heard whispering in his well before it happened. Like someone down there praying, he told the sheriff, but wrong or backwards. Eli listened, expression hard as weathered bark. "It ain't our doing," he said at supper, though nobody had accused them. "We put it to rest. Whatever haunts them now is their burden." The others nodded, but privately they wondered, had something escaped, something they'd stirred loose that refused to die quietly. The heat lingered cruelly through September. Storms rolled across the valley, heavy and loud but never merciful. One afternoon, thunder cracked and wind ripped through the Bellamy's field, snapping several stalks clean in half. When it passed, the ground lay pitted. Small circular depressions pressed deep into the soft mud, dozens of them perfectly spaced. That night they returned. Eli woke first, alarmed by the sound of footsteps on the porch. He roused Thomas, who quietly loaded the shotgun. They waited by the window, breaths shallow. The steps came again, light, deliberate, like a child's bare feet crossing wood. What they saw when lightning flashed froze them both. Dozens of figures stood motionless at the field's edge, outlines formed of smoke and dust, each holding something long and thin, like tools, arms, or bones. They didn't move closer. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. When the light faded, so did they, dissolving into mist. At dawn, the pale shoots had grown again, this time forming a perfect circle around the house itself. Closing the family in, Amelia fell to her knees in prayer, sobbing not from fear but fatigue, a grief older than faith. Eli said nothing. He walked to the field, shovel slung across his shoulder, and began to dig directly through the ring, the motion steady and furious. Thomas joined him without a word. The girls, watching from the porch, clutched each other tight. They dug until sunset, sweat mixing with earth, bodies trembling with resolve. When the spade struck something solid, they cleared it carefully. Not bone this time, but wood, an old box, half rotten, bound in iron nails. Inside, beneath layers of soil and rust, lay documents, ledgers, letters, deeds, names scrawled across parchment in fading ink. Ellen, William Bellamy, debts paid in land and silence. Eli froze. "She was ours," he whispered. "We buried our own blood." The truth settled heavier than any curse. Ellen, a girl promised to the family's founder, lost during the harvest of '62 when sickness swept Montgomery County. Her grave had been marked in secret to hide the shame that followed, her name erased from the ledger. That erasure had cursed them all. Amelia took the box, closed it slow, and pressed her hand atop it. "Then we'll remember her this time," she said, voice low but firm. "We'll end it the only way it can end, and with truth, not fire." That evening, the family carried the box to the churchyard in town. They set it deep among the elder graves, hands joined, salt scattered over the soil. No priest spoke. No townsfolk came. Just the Bellamys and the sound of distant thunder, easing at last into silence. And when they returned home, the circle in the field was gone. The house exhaled. The earth was finally still, not peaceful but resting, as if tired after long suffering. Years later, neighbors remembered that summer as the one when the Bellamy's land changed for good. It bore smaller crops, yes, but they were clean, sweet, and healthy. The family kept mostly to themselves, and yet each autumn, as harvest drew near and the wind turned sharp, a faint hum could be heard over the fields, not a cry nor a prayer, but something between them. It was said the Bellamys had learned the true cost of forgetting. The land would remember what they had chosen to face, and forgive what they chose never to hide again. With the box finally at rest among the shadowed stones and old cedars of Clarksville's graveyard, the Bellamys walked home in silence. Their boots crunched over gravel and dew-slicked grass, the sky above pale with the promise of another southern autumn. For the first time in memory, no one looked back over their shoulder. The house, ringed now by the gentle rebellion of crocuses and wild violets, stood quiet, a body at peace after a fever has broken. Life did not return to Bellamy Farm all at once. There was no miracle, no burst of new grain or sudden bounty to erase the memory of what had transpired. Instead, healing crept through the days the way the sun dissolved morning frost, gentle, determined, impossible to measure in the moment. Each meal, no matter how simple, felt like a small act of gratitude. Each night's sleep that was free from screams or chanting was a silent victory. Eli continued to walk the boundaries each morning, not out of fear, but ritual, a promise to himself and to those who could no longer speak that he would keep watch with clear eyes and an honest heart. Sometimes he paused by the patch where the circle had once blighted the earth and pressed a hand to the soil. The ground, soft and cool, gave under his weight but did not tremble. He no longer expected answers. The need to know why had been replaced by the steadier need to tend what remained. Amelia returned to her garden, coaxing color from hard ground, canning beans and tomatoes for winter. Her hands never truly clean, but no longer raw. She doted over Mary and Ruth, whose laughter took on a rhythm that rang true all the way to the battered stone fence. She taught them hymns, yes, but also stories of those who came before, not as ghost tales, but as lessons in humility, survival, and the sacred debt every generation owes to the next. Thomas grew into a man so quietly, no one marked the change, until one day he lifted Mary onto his shoulders with the effortless strength of their father, and the two of them howled and spun in the autumn breeze. He worked the fields, joined Eli on trips to town, brought back news without complaint or bitterness. Sometimes, when dusk stretched long shadows across the porch, he sat with Ruth and told stories of the old days, not to frighten her, but so neither of them would forget who they were, and what price their peace had cost. The Bellamys saw fewer visitors in the years that followed, but those who made the walk down the long lane left with a sense of quiet unease, as if the land itself was listening, marking each word and glance for remembrance. Some families avoided the farm still. Others brought gifts, apple preserves, bolts of fabric, the first tentative overtures of trust renewed. When misfortune struck other farms, a barn burnt by lightning, a fever that carried off a neighbor's only son, Eli and Amelia always brought what they could. Not just food or seed, but patience, help rebuilding, a presence that refused to be cowed by whispered doubts or inherited blame. Slowly, their neighbors began to see not a haunted family, but one who had endured, whose dignity was won by facing hardship head-on and never concealing the truth, no matter the pain. Decades later, as railroads cut through Montgomery County, and machines began carving the land with the indifferent power of progress itself, Bellamy Farm remained. The house, though never grand, outlasted storms and seasons, its timbers weathered but not broken. Children left and returned with new names, new stories, but always found their way back to the porch on late summer evenings, where the distant sound of cicadas and wind through the corn, what little would grow, became the background to 100 stories shared across generations. Some remembered the legend, the screams, the vanished harvest, the curse that held the fields in its grasp. Some said the Bellamys had outlasted the darkness through stubbornness. Others believed it was mercy, given once a buried debt had been paid and a lost soul remembered among her kin. Ruth and Mary came to teach their own children that sometimes salvation lay not in fleeing from fear, but in meeting it quietly, with hands open and hearts bared to what the land demanded as the price for life. And so, when the autumn wind picked up each year, rattling the dried husks and hushing the fields before first frost, the Bellamys listened, not in dread but in solemn gratitude. The land had kept their secrets, tested their resolve, and finally, granted them the grace of another season. The truth of their story rippled outward like a stone tossed in a pond, quiet at the center, but felt at every silent edge. It was never about defeating darkness, for the darkness would always return in some form. What mattered was what you left behind, not the scars, but the courage it took to bear them in daylight. On Bellamy Farm, this lesson became their legacy. The legend would not die, nor would it destroy them, so long as they held fast to the truth and to each other. In Tennessee, under a sky that could be as blue and merciful as it was mercurial and cruel, the Bellamys endured, unforgotten by the land and never again forgetting themselves. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity, So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.